Good evening and welcome. We are so glad that you are here this evening. And for those who are watching online, we want to thank you for joining us online. We hope that you will be enriched by the information that David Jones is going to bring to you. Before we begin, I'd like to just touch on a few things. Before you leave tonight, I would like you to stop by our information table. On that information table, you will find handouts, free giveaways, question and answer cards, and resources that will help you in your journey. You know, this program and the purpose of tonight and tomorrow and Sunday is that we can bring resources to help you, either in your own journey or helping someone else in their journey with mental health. We also want to let you know that we will have question and answer cards, and after each meeting, we will have a 15-minute question and answer session. So please, if you have questions, write them down on the cards, and we will be happy to answer them. If you need Spanish translation, speak with one of our representatives here tonight. They will get you a device that you can hear this in Spanish. And Dr. Arvizu will be interpreting for us, and I'm sure that you will enjoy this program. Upcoming events, this is just the beginning of a fantastic seminar. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we are going to be talking about domestic violence. And then after that at 3:30, we'll be talking about warning signs and recognizing these signs in our children. Also on Sunday at 2 and 3:30, we will be doing 2 other programs, which we will announce at that time. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, David Jones. Has worked in mental health for nearly 20 years. His experience includes working with high-risk youth, military veterans living with PTSD, and couples navigating difficult marital challenges. He currently serves as the acting chair for the psychology department at Weimar University and runs a private practice in Washington State. David's greatest passion is helping people move past their past so they can finally enjoy life in the present. Join with me as we welcome David Jones. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome to those of you who are here. Welcome to those of you who are here, and those of you who are joining us online. We do want to extend a welcome to you. So you should be able to see the slides as we go through tonight's presentation. So tonight we are going to be talking about healing the traumatized brain. And one of the questions I usually try to start with is just asking folks if they are familiar with trauma. So how many people here, just maybe by show of hands, understand a little bit about trauma, have heard about it? Okay, excellent. So we are going to be talking about trauma and how it affects the brain. So for the first portion of it, we're going to go through how it specifically affects the brain. But before we're done for this evening, we're going to conclude with looking at how we can begin to heal the brain when it experiences trauma. As was mentioned, there'll be several other lectures that we look at that get a little bit more into specific details, like how we deal with domestic violence, how we recognize warning signs in children. But for tonight, we're going to be starting with the brain. So when I think about trauma, one of the first things I try to picture is what is happening in the body. So maybe all of you have had this experience before where you're driving down the road, maybe you just listen to music or you're listening to a podcast or something on the radio. And while you're driving, everything's just humming along just the way you expect it to. And then suddenly you look down because you heard your phone buzz, and then you get a text message. Now, some of you are way more thoughtful about this than I am, but I sometimes think, I bet I can read this text and drive at the same time. Not a good idea. But anyway, you might pick up that phone and see the text, and then as soon as you look back up, you see red lights. And immediately you recognize something is wrong. You stomp on the brakes. Now, right in the moment as you're stomping on the brakes, you notice that your heart rate elevates. You notice that your palms can begin to sweat, which incidentally, your palms don't sweat because you're hot. Your palms sweat because you're stressed. You can get as hot as you want to, but your palms are not going to start sweating. They will only sweat if you're having a stress response. This is also sometimes why it could be indicative of like a heart condition. So anyway, palms are sweating. And then the other thing that can start to happen is you'll notice that if someone was having a conversation with you, suddenly the words that they're saying don't make a lot of sense. This is because when you're in a fight-flight response, your ears tune out the frequencies that the human voice usually speaks in and tunes in to the sounds that predators make, like low, rumbly tones. Then the next thing that you'll notice too is it becomes very hard to speak, which is why we can only come up with a few words, hopefully not choice words, but anyway, some words only come to mind and it's very hard to speak. Now, if you successfully stop before you hit the car in front of you, then you'll kind of take that, you have that nice exhale, you realize that everything is now fine and things will start to come back to normal. Now, when someone has PTSD or has trauma, the difference between the experience I just explained and what they experience is they stay stuck in that phase, right? So for you, once you've experienced this phase where you dodged the car accident and there was no fatalities, your body calms down. But when somebody has PTSD, the critical piece here is post-trauma. So it's what happens after the trauma that creates the condition, not the event. All right? Does that kind of make sense to everyone? So it's what happens after the trauma that determines whether or not we have a disorder, not the event. This is why some people have seen really terrible things like when 9/11 happened, there's all these people were on ground zero, saw all these events happen, but only 10% of people that witnessed it actually went on to develop PTSD. So that lets us know that it's not the event itself that causes trauma, it's how the body responds afterwards. So for people who experience PTSD, again, what's happening here is they don't come back down. All right. So the next thing I want to be able to share with you about trauma is that trauma is not what happens to us, it's what happens in us, right? Trauma is not what happens to you, but it's what happens inside of you. In a few slides, we'll be looking at the actual definition of the word trauma because it actually has some historical roots behind it. But the word trauma itself comes from the Greek word that refers to a physical wound. So when you hear the word trauma, think now about like a wound. This is like an injury or a scar. And so when somebody has a trauma, this means that they've been scarred by something. Now, when somebody experiences one of these invisible wounds, which happens a lot with combat veterans, they have these invisible scars. So they come back and they look fine. It's still the same person, maybe a little less facial hair, depending on what branch of the military and how they serve. But that's still the same person. But the problem now has happened because there's scars on the mind. So I'm going to walk you through just really quickly your stress response and kind of tell you exactly what's happening in your body when you have this kind of stress response and how we get through this piece of it. So your stress response is going to go through these 4 levels. At the very bottom, like can you see in that thermometer there, there's the calm state. This is where we feel everything feels like it's in a good space. Then we have the stress. This is kind of like how we might feel when there are deadlines and things we have to do at work. Then that SNS, that's going to be what's referred to as your sympathetic nervous system. This is your fight flight. And then you have something at the very top that's called your dorsal vagal response. So we're just going to walk through these, and I'm going to try to make these as clear as I can and give you illustrations along the way. So when we're at the bottom in that calm state, there are several things that are accompanied with this. First of all, is ventral vagal state. It's named after your vagus nerve. Now, has anybody ever heard of a vagus nerve before? Is that okay? So your vagus nerve is your 10th cranial nerve. Is one of the longest nerves in your body. The word vagus means like to wander. And so somebody who's like a vagabond, they wander around, where you have this nerve that wanders around through your body. It starts in your brain and it goes straight down into your stomach. Now, the reason this nerve is so important is because your vagus nerve is the nerve that connects your emotions to your body and your brain, so that you feel your emotions both in your thoughts and in your body at the same time, right? And so this is the nerve. Now, this nerve literally starts up here in your face and goes down into like your stomach. And it ends at the very bottom near where your intestines are. Now, when the part that's up top is active, this is when you're the most calm. It controls your voice. It controls how you talk. So like if you're talking to somebody, you're trying to be pleasant, you ever notice people kind of talk a little bit higher when they're trying to be inviting and they're trying to be sweet and charming? And then if somebody's serious, they kind of talk from their gut. When you do that, you're actually using your vagus nerve in different ways. So when we're in that calm state, we are experiencing the kind of state where we socialize, where we're able to recognize people's emotions, where we're able to connect with people. When we talked about that car accident situation, if I'm up in one of those higher stages, I can't do that as well. Also in this calmer state, something else that happens is I can feel grounded. I can actually experience things like enjoyment and satisfaction. And so this is where your parasympathetic nervous system is active. So we hear about fight, flight. The opposite on the other side of this is your rest, digest. This is where you can sit down and enjoy a lovely meal. This is when you can smile and look, the person that you care about in the eyes. This is when you can play with your kids. This is the state that we prefer to be in. But as we move up the thermometer here, the next state that we find ourselves in is the sympathetic state. This is where we have increased arousal. This is one of the examples that I use. I used to take a lot of walks in the morning. And when I would go walking in the morning, I like to use that time to kind of clear my head. For me, that involves me praying and doing something that helps me to feel grounded. But while I was walking, I sometimes walk when it's a little bit dark outside. And while I was walking, usually there's not a lot of other people out there because it's late, it's very early in the morning. But this particular morning, somebody was riding their bike. And that's not unusual, but this time they were riding very close. And I was just walking along, minding my own business. And then out of the corner of my eye, I didn't realize they were so close. They came within seemed like to me, a couple inches of my face. And my brain said, oh, no worries, it's just a guy on a bike. My body said, and I had that huge gasp response. And of course, I didn't want to look like I didn't know how to handle myself. So I tried to play off the gas by going, now, I doubt anybody really believed I was trying to cough at that point because I sounded like I was terrified out of my mind. But this is when that sympathetic state comes in. It doesn't ask your permission to turn on. It just turns on immediately. Now, if you know anybody or if you've experienced trauma yourself, you know that sometimes if you get hit with the trigger, that thing turns on immediately, whether you want it to or not, right? And so this is that stress stage. Now, stress is not all bad. We do need to be able to prepare. Part of the reason why my body gasps like that is because if somebody is trying to attack me from behind, I get that extra burst of air so I can turn around and fight or run. And so you actually want that little hit of oxygen. Anybody really into cars and like when cars have like a turbo on there, you can hear that whistle. When you gasp, that's kind of like turning on your body's turbo so that you can, right away respond. So it's not a bad thing, but if we're stuck in that state, this is when it becomes a problem. Okay, then on that third stage, this is where we've gone into that sympathetic. This is that fight flight where we've really gone into there. The stress stage right in between, sometimes we can have something that gets us a little bit more energized, but when we get into a full flight, we can't even reason through it. I wouldn't even be able to tell myself this was just a bike at that point. Now I'm 100% convinced that this must be a bear or a car is about to hit me, which is actually what I thought was happening in that moment. So that's the third stage. In this stage though, we're still not completely powerless. In this stage, I still believe I can fight back. I still believe that I can do something to protect myself. Now, where trauma comes into it is when we get to that fourth stage. So this is where we can experience freeze. So we've heard of fight, flight. We hear about that a lot, but there's two other stages and it's faint and freeze. Now, your body can actually cause you just to collapse. And it's kind of like a strategy that causes you to play dead. It's kind of a last resort. It's not the first thing you want to do if you're in a fight or if you're being attacked by somebody. You don't want to just faint immediately. But fainting is actually something that can save your life. In fact, before we're done this evening, I'll be showing you a video of how playing dead actually saved an animal's life. And you'll see why that we even do this for ourselves. So when we get all the way up to that top stage, that dorsal vagal, that DV, all the way at the top, that is the stage in which we freeze. In that particular stage, this is where we start to say things like, I feel helpless. This is where we can start to dissociate. This is where I can feel like I'm disconnected from my body. It feels like I'm watching myself from the outside, or my life starts to feel like I'm in a movie. And so if you've ever been in that kind of stage before, this is that stage. This is also the stage that people go when they start to feel really depressed. Like they can't really feel joys. They can't really feel happiness. They just feel as though they're disconnected from everything. And a lot of this happens because the person is trying to disconnect from their body. So just so I can give a quick example of this, I worked with we'll just say a young man who had been through some pretty terrible abuse. He was too young to fight back or defend himself. And so one of the things that he did is he kind of just went to some other place in his head. It was just like, well, what's happening to my body is too terrible. I can't stop it. So they just kind of went somewhere else, kind of went to their happy place in their mind. And it's actually really adaptive, because if you think about what that person is doing, it's like, well, I can't do anything with my body, so at least I can go kind of deliver myself in my mind. And so that's what the person does. Now, the challenge with that is that sometimes people go out that back door to escape the pain, but they can't get back inside all the way. And so what happens is they spend a lot of their lives feeling like they're kind of here, but kind of not there, not here at the same time. And so if anybody, again, has either experienced trauma or knows someone who's had trauma, you know what I'm talking about, where you're kind of there, you show up to work, you're having conversations, but it feels like you're just watching a movie. You can't quite connect with what's going on. That's this stage right here. Now, the good news about this ladder is if you can climb up the ladder, you can climb back down. And there's actually tips on how to do that. There are ways to come up and down this ladder. All right, so we're going to look at what are the main signs of PTSD. There are actually 4 main signs of PTSD. And the first one, as you can see up here on the screen, is the re-experiencing. When somebody has trauma, they don't remember what happened so much as they re-experience what happened. And there's a huge difference between the two. If you ask me to remember what it was like when I was in 6th grade and I had this first event where I decided to not be the shy kid and speak up and tell some terrible joke, I can tell you what that was like, and I can tell you some details. But if I had trauma around that experience, you ask me what was it like for me in 6th grade, and instead of telling you about a memory, you're going to see my face do this, like, yeah, I was sitting right there. And I remember this kid was sitting right there. I couldn't believe he was doing what he was doing. You're watching me reenact what happened rather than just remember and recount the details. I'm not telling you a story, I'm reliving it. Okay, so this is where flashbacks come in. This is where nightmares and dreams come in, is that the person is not remembering, they're reliving or re-experiencing. Number 2 is avoidance. So as you can probably imagine, if I have something terrible that's happened before, then I'm probably going to try to avoid things that remind me of it. So if there's certain smells or certain sights and sounds, then I'm going to try to get away from those things. So I remember when I was in my office, I had someone ask me to remove a picture, if just like they didn't want me to get rid of it completely. They just said, hey, when I'm here, would it be okay if we took that picture down? And I said, okay, well, I can do that, but can you explain to me a little bit why? It's, well, that picture looks just like something that was in my grandma's house. And when I was there, these terrible things used to happen. If you can take that down, that can help me to focus and concentrate. So avoidance of stimuli or avoidance of things that were present in the trauma is another piece that is a signal for PTSD. So some people don't want to go in tall buildings if they've been to 9/11 when those attacks. They don't want to be in a situation that feels like the old one. The next one is cognitive and mood. So it changes the way we think about things. So my thoughts become very absolute. So instead of like, I can't trust, I had a teacher who was really mean to me. So instead of believing that that was a bad teacher, now I don't want to talk to any teachers. All teachers are bad. Or the more popular ones that come up now is like, well, this person is associated with this political party, so all those people are bad because they did something. This is some of what happens with the thinking. It's very black and white, and everything is all good or all bad, or I'm all good or I'm all bad. And so things become very, very black and white. And then the last one is arousal. Arousal is just like that ladder that we were talking about, where somebody can go through those stages, but they stay too high up on there. So remember that thermometer had 4 stages? They usually stay up in the top 2. There is no really coming back down to the calm stage. They really stay up here all the time. And so there's a lot of energy put into making sure that things don't frustrate or upset them, because it's very easy to get to 10, especially if you're starting at 6. All right, does that make sense to everyone so far? So these are the things that accompany PTSD. This is what is happening in the body. So there are actually other subtle signs of PTSD that are not as well known. But the first one up there that I have is body dysmorphia disorder. This is when somebody thinks that they're physically not attractive, like kind of like with anorexia, like if somebody thinks that they're really fat when their bodies are actually quite thin. This actually, for people who have that disorder, almost 80 to 90% of people who have an eating disorder also have trauma. And that's a really, really high number. That's way above the normal population. So one of the major signals that somebody could have some historical trauma is if they also have a body disorder. Now, part of the reason this will happen is because the way the person sees themselves will actually change over time. They'll actually start to think of themselves as gross or weak, and this thing can really lead to other disorders. Other ones are rigid rituals, because everything has to stay quiet. No one can move too quickly. In fact, if you know any people who are firefighters or served in the military, if they go to a restaurant, do you know what part of the restaurant they want to sit in? Anybody know? Yes, the back. Now, why is that? So you can see everything in front of you, right? That's a way of making sure that nothing sneaks up on me, nothing catches me by surprise, right? And so the rules for how to deal with everyday life become very rigid because the person is stuck in a survival state. So when you think about when you're worried that you could be attacked, you actually get very rigid when you're worried your life is on the line. You get very meticulous about the rules you follow. In fact, do most of you who are present, do you live here in Truckee, around this area? All right, so when you're driving in the snow, do you drive a little differently than when there's no snow and ice on the road? Yeah. All right, anybody kind of clutch the wheel a little bit tighter, drive a lot slower, give yourself a lot more space? You can kind of think about PTSD like that. For them, they're always driving in the snow. It's always like, I got to make sure that I don't get off the road here because things can easily go wrong. So what is trauma? Continuing on this question here, there's also another aspect to this of how it affects children. Now, we're not going to get too far into detail on this, but with children, there are several things that can happen. You have a category over here of abuse. So that could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, or it could be sexual abuse. These are things that can happen to children. Those are the types of ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. Then you have neglect, which can be physical neglect, not meeting the child's medical or physical needs, feeding them, or emotional neglect. Sometimes we take for granted that children actually do have emotional needs. This became very obvious during like the potato famine. I believe this was in the 1930s or 1940s. When the potato famine happened, a lot of children, especially in Poland, were put into orphanages. And when they were put into those orphanages, they made sure these kids had their shots. They fed them every day. They changed their diapers and all this other stuff. And they were supplying all their physical needs, but the children kept dying in large numbers. Like, what's going on? Why are all these kids dying? And yes, what was happening is no one was holding them. Oh. Right? And just simply from a child not being picked up, a child not being held, a child not being reminded that someone can see their face, and doing all those little silly games where kid smiles at you, smile back at them. When they don't have that, they die. I'm not talking about they just feel worse, like they die. And the ones that actually survived went on to have shorter lifespans, higher disposition towards disease, and all kinds of things. So sometimes we think about abuse, like direct physical abuse being the worst way you can hurt a child, but neglect can be just as bad, and sometimes, in some cases, even worse than being physically abused, because at least if somebody's being physically abused, they know they exist, right? And so this is the depth of what happens. Now, just to put some solutions in here, because I know this is a lot of heavy things to be considering. This is also where some of the solutions come in, because when somebody can actually feel seen, heard, loved, these things actually have a curative effect on the body. If somebody looks you in the eye and really sees you, it actually does something to you. In fact, one of the reasons why a really effective therapy for people with PTSD is actually having a dog or a service animal. And you know why? How do dogs behave? Like they are happy to see you all the time. They're just happy to see you. You know, you could leave them in a hot car, don't do that, and crack the windows, and you could be gone for like an hour, but as soon as you come back, they're all happy to see you. Try that with one of your kids, or like one of your older kids, or try that with your spouse. They're probably not gonna be as happy as your dog is to see you. But being accepted and loved like that really begins to do something to heal the nervous system. All right, so the next thing I wanna be able to share with you is how these things kind of show up in these different stages. And so there's three types of trauma that typically can come up. One of them is developmental trauma. So that's, of course, when this happens in childhood. The second type is the kind of trauma that happens like with shock trauma. This is something that happens all of a sudden. You're just minding your own business and boom, you know, something happens, like the car accident happens right behind you. There was a car accident that happened right in front of my house before. And so like I've had these things kind of happen. It was unfortunately a fatal accident that happened. There was no way for me to prepare for that. It just happened. And then the third kind of trauma that can happen is chronic or environmental trauma. That's where you're maybe in a war zone where there's just constantly conflict going on around you. Even things like domestic violence is something that can cause a lot of trauma for kids. When they hear their parents fighting constantly, this becomes a chronic trauma. Now, of the three, the two that are the hardest to deal with are the developmental and the chronic ones, because these are so difficult to treat, because it's hard to just narrow it down to a single target that's causing all the problems. All right, so then something else that you want to understand about trauma is something called learned helplessness. Has anybody heard of learned helplessness before? Yes. Okay, so there's this fun little cartoon that gives us a little bit of an idea what learned helplessness is. So what Siegel and his colleague there, what they did is they had these dogs exposed to several conditions. Oops, sorry about that. They had them exposed to several conditions. So in condition one, the dogs were set in a cage and they were given the opportunity at a certain period of time where the door would just open and they can jump out. So no big deal. They're in the cage and then the door opens and they get out. So that's your control room. The second one was put in a cage where they electrified the bottom of the cage. Now, why you would do this to dogs, I don't understand, but nevertheless, we get to learn something about it for dogs. So they put the dogs in the cage and they electrify the bottom. But then what they did is they put a button inside the cage so that all it has to do is hit the button with its nose, and then it can hop right out, and then they survive and they're fine. I mean, all of them are going to survive, but they get to escape from the pain. Then they had a third condition where what they did is they put the dogs in the cage, they electrify the bottom, but they don't provide any way to get out. All right, now between those three conditions, without y'all necessarily having to go to school for a bunch of years or become scientists, which one of those groups do you think experienced trauma? So, well, it was actually just the last one, right? And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is the first group had a way, well, the first group didn't have any shock, so they were fine. But the second group actually had a means by which to escape. All they had to do was push a button. So as soon as I finish explaining this, I'm going to share a real case example of how this works. So after they put them through these three conditions, they now have these dogs in a new condition where half of the cage is electrified and the other half of the cage is fine. And all the dog has to do is jump over that little wall. And as you can see, that wall is quite small and very easy to get over. So once they got this going, here's what happened. The first two dogs, when they were getting shocked, they immediately said, hey, don't like this. This doesn't feel good. They hopped right over the wall and everything was cool. But when they got to the last set of dogs, when they got electrocuted, they didn't bother to move at all. They just accepted that this must be how life is, right? And this is one of the reasons why when people have experienced trauma, they can be very vulnerable to being victimized again, because they learn to just freeze and say, well, this is just how it is, right? Now, there's a good reason why people do this, because remember at the in one of those slides, I was saying that you can kind of disconnect, you can go out that back door to kind of save yourself. That's what these dogs have learned how to do, is to go out the back door. But they're so used to going out the back door that they don't realize there's a door to leave. They don't know how to go out the front door to get out of the situation that they're in. Now, pause it really quickly. There is a way out of trauma. Part of the thing that keeps us locked in a traumatic experience is because we've not found that door that allows us to get out of this position that we're trapped in. But there is a door that allows you to get out, right? But one of the things is now you have to relearn. You have to relearn how to get out of the situation. And this is what a lot of therapies are focused on, is how to get to the place where you can get through that front door. Okay, so I'm going to forego this one because I know there's a lot of slides here, but if somebody has questions about the parts of the brain that are active during learned helplessness, please just let me know. But those slides, we're going to try to make those available for anybody who likes to get into the technical information. Okay, so in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to watch how the learned helplessness response is actually adaptive, but then how you use that same response to survive. So we're going to get this going. I don't think there's any sound, so I don't think you have to worry about sound, but we'll just watch this clip really quick here. Okay, so it's going to be a hyena, and this hyena sees that a cheetah has caught a gazelle, and he wants that food. Cheetahs are not very large animals, so he's not going to try to fight with that hyena. And so now he's going over there and he's trying to eat the gazelle. The gazelle looks like it's dead and it's just laying there doing absolutely nothing. Hyena goes over there to chase him off. Gazelle realizes, I don't have to put up with this, and he runs. I thought that was fantastic. And that is why we do that. Playing dead is a last resort. Going out the back door is a last resort. But animals, unlike humans, actually have figured out how to go back inside and say, you know what, I'm actually still alive. I'm going to jump. I'm going to make sure that I go back into that, into my body and get out of there. And so this is one of the ways I try to explain to people why you don't need to feel guilty if in your trauma you didn't fight back or didn't do anything. It's because your body knows that that's a last resort. And so what oftentimes happens with our thoughts is we'll say things like, it's my fault, I had no choice, I'm being punished. We can say things that feel really permanent, like things will never improve, I'll never pass my test, etc. These are the learned helplessness thoughts. But we want to be able to move from these thoughts to ones that allow us to actually escape from this state. All right, so I'm going to pass on that. So how your brain works in trauma. So I have a free brain model, and everybody has one. And we went through great expense, and forgive me for the bad joke already. But if you actually check underneath your pews, you will find a model that is underneath your seat. And if you just kind of reach under there, you're going to find yourself a brain model, and it's under your pew. And so if you reach down there, you can grab it. And then as soon as you grab that thing, you make sure that you pull out your hand, because your hand is going to be your model for today. All right. So your hand can actually become a model for your brain, so you can actually understand what is happening to you when you experience a traumatic experience. So this is the hand model of the brain. So if you have your hand like this, your fingers up here will represent your frontal cortex. Your thumb right here represents your emotional or limbic system. And the palm of your hand right here is going to represent your brainstem. Now, if you fold your fingers over your thumb like this is how your brain is actually planted in your forehead right now. And up here, these are the higher functions of your brain that allow you to think and reason and have emotional control. In fact, if you notice that your middle and ring finger kind of wrap around your thumb, this right here is what's called your medial prefrontal cortex and your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These are the parts of the brain that connect your higher thoughts to your emotions, right? And so when you are in a good state, in that calm state, your brain is online. But let's say you have that traffic situation like I talked about before. So when the traffic situation happens, you end up in this state. So it's kind of like, now there's a disconnect. This is why it's harder to talk and think straight when somebody just cuts you off, or when you think you're going to get in a car accident, you're not doing math at that time. And it's because these parts are disconnected. Now you're mostly in your emotional brain. Now, if this gets overactivated, and let's say the car accident does happen, you can't believe what just happened. Your ears are ringing. You're just sitting there and you're in shock. Now what's happened is even the emotional parts of your brain have come offline. And now this is what we call when you've kind of flipped your lid and you've gotten totally dysregulated. All right, does that make sense to everyone? So what we want to do is, if we want to put the brain back together again, we want to actually reconnect first with the emotions. This is why if like somebody's experiencing a trauma, you can't just talk to them and say, hey, this isn't reasonable. You're not being rational. Go try that with somebody who experiences PTSD. Like if you talk to a veteran who hears like backfire and they think it's a gun, you say, hey, look, John, it's not a gun. That doesn't work. If you're actually going to connect with the person, you have to connect with them where they're at in their brain. So the first thing you have to do is you're going to have to speak to the body, because that's what this base part of the brain is for. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to connect with them. I'm just going to and I've done this before, but I've come right alongside somebody and just physically just been present with them. And any words that I say start out very simply. It's like, that was kind of scary. I don't try to rationalize with them. I just said, that was kind of scary. And they're like, yeah, man, I'm sorry. I just, and they can't get their words together. So, all right, let's just take a second to breathe. Sometimes I'll give somebody a glass of water, and all I'm doing is I'm making sure that their body calms down, because I know that we have to put the emotions back in place and we have to connect with the body again. After they get a little bit calmed down, now I start to talk to them, but my words start out simple. It usually can take almost like 10 minutes sometimes to get them regulated enough to where everything comes back online and their brain is back intact. All right. Now, for the average person, the times where you lose it a little bit, it's like maybe your kid's throwing a fit, or your spouse is getting on your nerves, and then you say that thing you didn't mean to say. You've kind of done this thing right here. You've kind of flipped your lid a little bit, but you're still kind of intact. You kind of know you probably shouldn't have said that, but you're not completely out of control. When somebody experiences a full-on trauma response, it's all offline. All right, so that kind of makes sense to everybody?
Yeah.
And this is a really good way to understand what your brain is doing. In fact, you have what's called a high road and a low road for your brain. So in that picture there, what do you see in that picture on the left? It looks like a snake, right? So if you're walking along and you're just taking a stroll, there's lots of places to hike around here, and you see something like that, guess what your body's probably going to do? It's going to jump. You say, kill him, like step on him. Yeah, well, yeah, so you're going to either go into a fight or flight state, right? You're going to do something about the threat that you see there. Now, the reason this happens is because you have what's called a high road and a low road in your brain. The low road goes straight from your eyes back to your thalamus, and then right into like your sympathetic nervous system. I'm sorry, I'm going to stand up here so you all can see what I'm talking about, because you can't really quite read it. So this is something goes to your eye, goes back to your thalamus, then to your amygdala, and then boom, tells your body to get active. Now, after you've had some time to look at it, you say, wait, that thing's not moving, and it's got a branch at the back. Snakes don't have branches. Then you realize that it's actually that. So now what happens is now your vision goes here, thalamus kicks it back out to the outer parts of your brain, this part up top, then takes it all the way over here to the prefrontal cortex so you can reason about it, then goes back to your amygdala saying, hey, everything's fine, just calm down over there. And then your fear response is a lot more regulated. It's just a stick, but you might step on the stick for good measure. So that's the high road versus the low road. The low road is way faster than the high road. In fact, your body will jump before you even know what you saw. That's how fast it is. And it's designed to be fast because you don't have time to second guess if it's a snake. You want to get out of the way. Anybody know how fast a snake is, by the way? So you're yeah, really fast. So like your reaction time is somewhere about between 0.2 of a second and maybe half a second if you're just concentrating on something else. A snake has the ability to dart, bite, and retract within 0.2 of a second.
Wow.
Which means that you won't even perceive that something happened until it's long done. So you don't have time to take the long road to find out whether or not the threat's there. So your brain is very efficient in prioritizing threat over benefit every single time. So it's not weird. So trauma makes that, just turns that up to 11. All right. So some of you may remember this. I'm not really promoting any movies, but I remember this line from this movie when I used to watch movies. And, you know, Forrest Gump and Jenny, they come back to this house where all these terrible things have happened to her. And the line there, he says, sometimes I guess there just aren't enough rocks. And if you remember that one, she came back to that old house where all these terrible things happened, and she has this big emotional release. She's throwing rocks at the house and is, upset with her dad for all the things that he had done. And then she sits down and she cries. Of course, Forrest, in his very simple manner, just says, oh, I guess there's just not enough rocks to throw. But there's wisdom in his words, and that's part of the reason why that movie was so successful, because there aren't enough rocks to fix this one. This is why if I was beat up, I can't beat up enough people to make myself feel powerful. If I was hurt by somebody, I can't go on enough dates and do it right to feel like I've undone that memory, because that's not how you do it. You can't fix the past by just simply trying to do things differently in the present only, but you actually have to go back to the past and fix it. It's not the house on the outside that you need to worry about. It's the house that's left on the inside. That's why the rocks never get the job done. So you have some parts of your brain that have some really specific functions. As I was saying before, that DLPFC, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, I like to think about this as like the coach in your brain. It's the part of your brain that tells your nervous system that, hey, everything's fine, or you're going to get through this. Again, these are all parts of the brain that shut off. When the DLPFC, when that part shuts off, it's also your timekeeper. It's why when people kind of flash back into a memory, it feels like time stops. That's not your imagination. You can actually look at brain scans and those parts of the brain go completely quiet. And so it feels like whatever's happening right now is happening forever. It gives it that timeless fashion that makes it very difficult to escape. But again, if you know what parts of the brain are shutting down, then you also know what parts of the brain you have to start exercising. If you think about these like muscles, if you work these things out, then they actually can come online when you need them. The medial prefrontal cortex, there's a picture of a tower there. And that's because it's kind of like that. It's like the watchtower of the brain. It's supervising everything that's going on at all times, but it's also a part that allows you to connect with people on an emotional level. Your thalamus, you see that chef hat there? So your thalamus is what takes all of your senses and cooks them up together and puts together your experience. So the reason why, as I'm standing up here and you hear me talking, you can pair my voice with my mouth moving, is because your thalamus puts those things together. When your thalamus isn't working, then those two things don't even begin to connect. Everything actually becomes very disintegrated when that happens. So when people experience like a trauma response, a lot of times they can feel very confused in like a situation where they're overwhelmed. And that's because all the senses that are coming in, the sounds, the lights, and all these movements, they're not connecting anymore. It's like the ingredients are all over the place. If you want to make a cake, you want to have the flour and the sugar and all that stuff. You want to mix it in a bowl. But if I throw the flour over here and the eggs over there, and then like, pour the salt and sugar on the ground, am I going to have a cake? Absolutely not. I'm going to have a mess. But that's what can happen in the brain. When that part of the brain stops working properly, it throws everything all over the place and doesn't allow the person to put the world together in a cohesive way. So part of what helps to treat trauma is helping people to learn how to bring their senses back together again, to actually pay attention to what's going on in their bodies when they're talking and really attend to both the words that people are saying and how they're saying them. It's almost like you have to train yourself all over again to reconnect all the dots back together so that the world makes sense. So people oftentimes will ask, what is wrong with me? But again, as I mentioned before, it's because the wiring gets backwards, kind of like this chair that you can see here. As you all can probably tell, somebody missed an instruction. And what's going on with that chair? Can you see what instruction they missed there? Yeah. So the front legs kind of not facing the way that you want it to. But this is kind of what happens in the brain. It's a humorous picture, but like when it happens in our brain, it's not as funny because the wiring can get backwards on there, and the chair can become as much of a threat as it is a help. I don't know how many people want to sit in that chair because that would seem really difficult and could cause some serious pain depending on how you land on that. All right. So how to heal in therapy. So this is a little poem that somebody wrote about therapy, and I thought it was a really cute one, but it helps to explain one of the primary mechanisms that helps someone heal after a trauma. It says, I don't go to therapy to find out if I'm a freak. I go and I find one and only one answer every week. And when I talk about therapy, I know what people think. They think that it makes you selfish and in love with your shrink. But oh, how I loved everybody else when I finally got to talk so much about myself. Now, that makes it sound like somebody's being selfish, but that's not what they're talking about. The reason why they actually were able to love other people is because if you hate yourself, it makes it very hard to connect with others. And the reason why people actually want to be able to speak about themselves is not because they're trying to be arrogant. It's because people actually want to be seen. When somebody doesn't feel seen, they don't feel connected, and they don't seem like anybody knows them or is aware of their experience or their presence, people actually can begin to feel more alone. And by the way, after COVID-19, when people were isolating, do you know that depression and anxiety rates have skyrocketed since then? And people even like that I knew who were very extroverted, they said after COVID, they still feel really anxious talking to people. It actually does something to your system. We are, as human beings, designed to be seen. We're designed to be heard. And when we're not seen and heard, it actually drives us crazy. Do you know what the universal way is of punishing prisoners, even the most hardened criminals? You know what they do to punish them? Social isolation. Now think about that. I mean, this is even people who have killed people and done horrible things, and they are still tortured by the idea of not being seen. So being seen is one of the most healing things that can happen for somebody who has trauma. To really be seen and heard is a tremendous benefit. One of the other things that's kind of cool is that when you are really listening and attuned to somebody, it's not just that you're listening to them and hearing the sound of their voice. If you're really attuned to somebody, there's a whole bunch of things that line up. All right, so how many people have watched, parents with their children and they make a face at them and they stick out their tongue and they go, and then the child sticks out their tongue? You've seen that before? Now, do you know how early children learn how to mirror their parents' facial expressions? Within minutes after being born, even the smallest infants will try on some little level to imitate what you're doing. Now, they can't make a lot of facial expressions, but one of the surefire ones that you can do is stick out your tongue, because they kind of know how to do that, and they go like the little lizard tongues. Anyway, so they will try to imitate you. Now, what's incredible about this is that when you start to line up with somebody, they call this neural synchrony. It's not just your facial expressions that can begin to line up. It actually turns out that your brain will start to fire in a similar pattern as the person you're talking to if you feel connected enough with them. And take that a step further, if you're really attuned to somebody, even your heart rates will begin to line up. Now, I'm pretty sure that none of you ever just put your hand on somebody else's chest to see, like, wait, let me sync that up with yours. That's not usually how that works. But when you feel really connected with somebody, you're connecting with them on more than just a visual level and more than just an intellectual level. If you're really attuned to somebody, even your heart rates and your brain frequencies will begin to line up. Now, here's why this is really cool for trauma, because oftentimes the person sitting across from me is really dysregulated. But if I can stay really calm, I can talk to them and say, hey man, how are you doing today? I'm okay. It was kind of a rough day at home. And I notice what happens is, even if they're super elevated, if I stay where I am, eventually their voice starts to sync up with mine. And they actually get to borrow my state of mind so they can get out of theirs. And what an incredible thing that you can actually do with somebody by just spending time with someone and just talking with them, because it might be the only 5, 10, or 30 minutes where they actually feel normal, because they get to feel how you do. Incredible stuff. Love is a relief from scanning the outer world for threats and the inner world for shame. I love that statement. When people experience the sense of being loved by another person, it actually tells them that they can take a break from trying to see if somebody else is out to get them. So I don't have to sit in the corner of the room because I know you got my six, so I know you got my back. I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm a good enough person because I know that you actually care about me. When you start to build these foundations again, the person can now start to internalize this idea that maybe I'm actually safe, maybe I'm actually loved. I could say so much about this. But therapy, one of the things that I'm able to do in therapy with people is we're able to talk through the emergency of trauma. but create the safety at the same time. So we can talk about the gunfire, we can talk about the assault and whatever else happened, but when they're in my office, they know that's not going to happen again. And so now I'm safe to process through it without feeling vulnerable or judged or any of these other pieces. And because I can experience this emergency in the presence of somebody who's safe, then I can actually feel safe in the presence of an emergency. And that's exactly what you want the person to be able to take inside. Okay. Just a few other things that I'm going to go over before we finish up for tonight. So I'm going to leave time for questions. Has anybody ever heard the term trigger? You've heard triggers. People say people get triggered. Okay. So when we say that somebody is triggered, there's a big difference between being triggered and then just being bothered, right? Like if somebody slaps me in the face, I'm not necessarily triggered. I just don't like that. And I'm sure most of y'all don't like being slapped in the face either. The difference though is that if I'm triggered, if someone slaps me in the face, I might have a normal upset response, like, what are you doing? But if I'm triggered, I get slapped in the face and now I think it's my dad again. And then I just go off and lose it. I black out and now it's on. That is a trigger. And what I tell people about triggers is that triggers are real because my nervous system is really responding like I'm dealing with my dad again, or I'm dealing with that threat again, but they're not necessarily true. That person who slapped me in the face is actually not my dad. And so one of the things I try to teach people is how to recognize the difference between a trigger and a response. And if you can see the difference between the two, then you can start to act more on the response and less on the trigger. The trigger tells me I'm a kid again and I have to fight this man because he's going to try to kill me. The response says, hey, this person needs to back up out of my space and just give me a little space so I can breathe. I'm going to respond to those things very differently. So I want to be able to distinguish between triggers and responses. All right. So just giving the last few things here, resilience is another way to be able to build up with trauma. So one of the examples that is used is there was a woman who knew martial arts, and she had trained in martial arts because she had experienced an assault before. Somebody attacked her and stole something from her, and it became this really terrible ordeal. So she learned martial arts, but she didn't just learn a little bit of martial arts. She went all the way up to like, second, third degree black belt, like very, very trained. And so she's like, all right, I got this. And so she goes out one night and somebody holds her up at gunpoint and says, give me your purse. And she realized that she could have beat him up, but everything in her body froze instead. And she still ended up, losing her wallet and kind of getting hurt in that situation. She could not figure out why. But what she did is she asked the people at the next training, she says, this time I want you to do something because I need to get back into ground zero. And so ground zero for her meant being back in that spot where she felt like she was helpless and couldn't fight back. And so they actually had her pinned on the ground. She's like, I want you to do this. Of course, it was safe because these guys all knew who she was, but they pinned her down and she said, don't like intentionally try to let me up. I need to be able to fight through this. What she did is she put herself back into ground zero and she fought her way out. And it was almost like her body got to go back into that moment, but do it differently this time, like in the exact moment that she needed to happen again. Now, fast forward a few weeks later, she's walking back to her car. I don't know why this lady, maybe she didn't go walk at night, but anyway, she's walking back to her car and like these gentlemen come to her and they want to try to mess with her. And this time she's like, oh, y'all want to do something. And she kind of had this like, all right, why don't you all bring it on? And so both of these guys were walking toward her until they saw her walking toward them. And they're just like, no, thank you. This woman is not afraid of us. And they turned and went the other way, which is incredible. She turned off the learn helplessness switch because she went back to ground zero, but did it differently this time. It's changing your story. This young man, Charles Hunt, he's now actually a millionaire, but he started out in the ghetto. Like his parents weren't really there for him. He went through a lot of really negative, adverse experiences. But at some point, he ran into some mentors and some people who told him, hey, you can probably do better with yourself. And he actually made the decision to turn his life around. And so he started going to school. He started looking into how he could learn business. And he actually was quite successful. Like I said, he owns a company and now actually has millions of dollars now and is doing really well. And I remember what he said at the end of his talk. He said, the worst of life couldn't take out the best of me. And I thought that was absolutely inspiring. His faith was also a big piece of what helped him to get through. But he said, the worst of life could not take the best of me. He came up with a story that was bigger than his trauma. And from there, he was able to begin to heal from that trauma. Okay. So these 3 steps around the somatic experiencing, how your body goes through this. One of them is allowing your body to shake things off. The second one is getting reconnected with the body, which we talked a little bit about this already. And the third one is find a safe space in your body. These are three things that go into what's referred to as somatic experiencing. So I'm not going to jump too much into these because one of our later presentations on Sunday, I'm going to go way more into detail into how this works. But somatic experiencing is just like what that woman did in Ground Zero. In fact, I have a quick clip here, and we're going to see a polar bear, and this polar bear is going to get tranquilized, but you're going to watch how the polar bear avoids getting traumatized. And so if you've not seen this before, hopefully you'll find this to be very interesting, but the polar bear has some tips on how to not get traumatized. All right. So I may skip along just a little bit in here, but I'll show you the first part of this. So here's the polar bear. And as the polar bear is there, the people are flying around in a helicopter. Now, as you can imagine, polar bears don't know what helicopters are. And so a helicopter probably looks like the largest dragonfly in the world if there are any dragonflies in the Arctic, which there are probably not. And so he's getting chased down by this thing. He's, of course, running away, and it's not going to do any good. Guy pulls out a tranquilizer. Bear's looking back like, what are you guys doing? What is this gigantic thing chasing me? And they trank him. Okay. Let's see if I can skip that along a little bit. Oh, yeah. So you look at those gigantic claws. I wish you all can hear it because when he starts to growl, it is just incredible. But you can see how large those paws are. He has little anti-skid things on his paws so he doesn't slip on the ice. You know, so like your tires have the little spikes on them. His hands actually have something like that too. And so they're checking his teeth and doing all these things with him. And of course, that's why they tranquilized him so that he wouldn't turn around and bite them. Okay. So once they put the right chemical concoction in his body, it starts coming back online. But what is it doing there? What do you see it's doing? It's shaking. Now it's totally conscious. It's completely conscious. But the reason it's shaken is because it's experienced a whole bunch of stress, and all that stress is stored inside of its body. And so what it's doing is it's shaking until it lets all of that stress out of its body. And it's also, when it's doing this, you can't hear it right now, but it's taking these really deep breaths in. Now what it's doing is it's purging all of these toxins and things out of the body that build up as a result of going through this trauma. So while you're watching that, I'll explain one last thing here. When it's moving its arms and legs like this, it's actually taking itself back to the chase. Now in the chase, it ran and then it got shot. And then from its perspective, it probably thought it died, but it realizes it's alive now. So when it comes back online, it goes back into the chase, and this time it runs away. And so it's like it replayed the story, but this time, instead of dying, it actually plays a story where it survives. And then it gets up and the polar bear shakes it off, and the polar bear does not have PTSD. Now, you ever wonder how animals don't end up with trauma? Like zebras, like every other day, their cousin, brother, sometimes their parents are getting eaten. So how do they not have ulcers? There's a book called like, Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers? The reason they don't is because they shake things off afterwards. Now, there was actually a young boy, Vessel Browner talked about this in his book. He talked about how there was a young boy who was there when 9/11 had happened. He was at a daycare nearby, and he saw people jumping out of the buildings, which is, awful. But this kid had a lot of support. He had a good support system. And so afterwards, he actually did not experience like any PTSD. But when he saw the therapist again, he was drawing some pictures, and he had drawn the buildings, but this time he noticed something different about the drawings. In the drawings, there were these little black circles at the bottom of the buildings. And the therapist said, "Hey, what are those?" He's like, "Oh, those are trampolines. So just in case something like this ever happens again, if the people jump out of the buildings, they won't die this time." He rewrote the story. He rewrote the story where it ends with victory this time, where something good comes out of something terrible. And this kid does not have trauma. So remember, we talked about how trauma means wound. Now there's a related word, and it's the word vulnerable. Now the word vulnerable actually is related to the word wound. And if we were just saying it in kind of a little bit of a distorted English way, we would say if somebody is vulnerable, that means they're traumatizable. Now, oftentimes when somebody's experienced trauma, they don't want to be vulnerable again because they don't want to get hurt again. But here's the problem. If you don't allow yourself to become vulnerable again, then you actually don't heal. So crabs have this incredible ability to grow. But if they want to grow, since they have exoskeletons, guess what they have to do with their shells? Yeah, they have to break them off. Now, it goes through an incredible process, by the way. All of their body excretes all of this enzyme, and what it does is it breaks the shell off of every part of their body, including their eyes. It'll break the shell off of there too. And then it'll be soft bodied, it'll be vulnerable. So it goes and hides under a rock because it needs to protect itself for a short period of time. But it's during that time when it breaks out of its hard shell that then it grows. And so the only way to grow is we first have to be vulnerable. But if we're going to be vulnerable, we need to feel safe. And so one of the other things that people have to do when they experience trauma is they have to find a place where it's safe to grow. It's safe to grow, which is exactly why children need that kind of safety, because that's what they're spending all their time doing. And it's also why they're very vulnerable to trauma, because they're growing. So they need a safe place to grow. So part of the need for somebody who's experienced trauma is to find a place where they can be vulnerable again. So that then they can begin to heal. Over time, after the crab has grown, then the shell gets hard again so that it can continue on its journey of being a crab and do what crabs do, which unfortunately does not mean just being eaten. All right, so I'm going to skip over to the end on this one because I'm going to save some of the additional tips on how to heal from trauma for our next presentation. But if you have questions about them, I'll come back to them because there are some really incredible things that you can learn about it. But I want to end tonight by telling you about a really incredible Japanese pottery. Has anybody ever heard the term kintsugi before? Okay, so for those of you who have not, kintsugi is a special kind of artwork. It is an artwork of pottery where you take the pottery and you break it. And after you've broken it, what you do is you use precious materials like silver and gold and precious metals, and you use those to be the very things that you use to piece the thing back together. So that piece of pottery, these pieces of pottery that you see, that started out as broken, it's in the very areas where the breaks have happened, where the beauty is applied. And so the most precious things on earth are used to heal the places where it's been broken. And when I've worked with people, I've seen the same thing, that oftentimes it's right where we've been broken where we can also experience the most profound and even beautiful things that can come into our lives afterwards. And so trauma does not have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of one that is far more beautiful. Now, every religion has different ways of talking about that. You know, kintsugi probably comes from that art also probably comes from some belief systems that exist there. And for some people who come from the Christian belief, they're familiar with the fact that when humanity was visited with its brokenness, what was provided for humanity was the most valuable thing that God can find. And for him, that was sending his son. And that precious gift was used to put together the parts that were broken. So the most precious materials are used to mend us just where we broke. And to make those broken areas in our lives the most beautiful things in our lives afterwards. So we can still heal. We can still heal. It's not over. There is a way to move from these things and for the brain to be healed. And we'll continue to talk about that as we continue through our program. But for this evening, we'll pause here and I will definitely take any questions that anyone has. But I do thank you for your time and attention for the presentation this fall. So thank you. Right. Okay. All right. So we do have some question cards, I believe, in the back. And
if anybody has any question cards, raise your hand and I'll grab them.
Yes, but for tonight, if you do have questions, you can just directly raise your hand too, and I can take them from the front. But we'll also have question cards that we can use if anyone has any questions you want to write down and ask at a later time. But just any questions that come now. Yes.
Can neuroplasticity work with mental damage? I know it works with physical damage to the brain, but can it work in a mental or emotional damage?
Okay, so the question was, can neuroplasticity work with emotional damage? Because yes, there's lots of research that demonstrates that even if somebody experiences damage to one part of their brain, the brain will rewire around that and find a way to work. And the answer is absolutely yes, it can. And this is actually what is exactly going on when somebody experiences a trauma or any other kind of mental health disorder. When they undergo therapy or any kind of treatment that they do, you can actually look at brain scans and their brains will be wired differently post-therapy than they was before. And so yes, by practice, through repetition, through deep connection, all of these things actually stimulate the kind of growth in neuroplasticity that's necessary in the brain in order for the brain to rewire itself. So 100%, it absolutely can. Okay. Okay, so breaths. So being able to, somebody's asking about being able to take breaths and how that works. Okay, so if you want to be able to calm your nervous system, breathing is one of the surefire ways to do it. So the way that you do this is you breathe in for a count of 6. And if you want to try this, you can. So you breathe in through your nose for a count of 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you hold 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you go out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, when you do that, first of all, if you do that a few times, you're going to feel pretty chilled out. Your breath is the only part of your autonomic nervous system that you have the most voluntary control over. Now, when you breathe in, if you actually put your hand on your pulse or on your heart, you will notice that your heart rate actually speeds up while you're breathing in, but it slows down while you're breathing out. And so part of the reason you want to make sure your out breath is longer than your in breath is because over time, your heart rate will spend more time going slow than it does going fast. And if you do this, it actually brings the whole thing down so that you're actually able to regulate your heart rate. A second breathing strategy that is really helpful is you breathe all the way in. I won't make you do this right now, but you breathe in as much air as you can until you get all the way up to the top. And then once you get to the very top, you try to take in 2 more extra breaths, like even just a little bit more, and then you allow all that to go out. You do that about 2 times, your nervous system will calm down very quickly. And there's a number of reasons for that, but this is another way of putting the brakes on your accelerated heart rate and helping to tone your body down. We'll talk more about more strategies next time, but those are 2 really quick breathing strategies you can do. If you do the 6, 7, 8 breathing, I would say do at least 5 to 10 breaths on that. If you do this kind of breathing, do about 5 of those, and that also tends to help calm the nervous system. All right. Any other questions for this evening? Yes.
Yeah, can impact on the brain cause you have trauma? I mean, not trauma, but PTSD.
Yeah. So
Like,
yeah.
you know, let's say you star windshield, or like here or something. Can that cause
PTSD?
PTSD?
Yeah, so only if, so the difference between like a typical head trauma and PTSD is that PTSD is going to have the emotional factor that's involved. Whereas just a straight physical head trauma doesn't necessarily lead to having the emotional component, right? Like, so it may not lead to flashbacks and re-experiencing and all those pieces.
So can it cause the emotional?
Yes, if it was scary to you, right? Like, so the big piece is, was it terrifying to you? Was it something that felt completely overwhelming to you? If it didn't feel terrifying and overwhelming, then you are unlikely to have PTSD. But if it felt terrifying and overwhelming, then it can cause it. So when I work with veterans, they've had when you talk about getting the bell rung, so they've had like, these IEDs go off and they've exploded, and like it'll cause their ears to ring and like their heads to like ring and all this other stuff. And you can get head traumas from that, concussions. But they don't always have PTSD afterwards. But you can imagine that if you get blown up or you're almost blown up, that can traumatize you. So you can have both happen at the same time. And it does happen fairly frequently, especially if it's if the event that led to the head trauma was something that was terrifying. Does that answer? Okay. All right. Yes.
When we're showing the polar bear
Mhm.
shaking,
Mhm.
do a lot of people, when they're healing from a trauma, do they have seizures?
That's a really good question. So the question was, when people have traumas, like have an actual physical trauma, do they have seizures? Sometimes if somebody goes through the process, sometimes they can go through like a kind of a shaking ritual. If they do have like a seizure that's related to trauma, that's what's called a psychogenic seizure. And they absolutely can have something like that happen, where psychogenic just means it originates in the brain. It has a psychological origin rather than a physical one. And so yes, somebody can, but a lot of times people don't get to have that experience. So immediately after a trauma, I'll just share something with you that a trauma trainer shared with me. One of the things she said is that after people have a trauma, one of the things she does, she has people kind of go like this. They have some that kind of squat down and breathe up and go like really hard in, and then just kind of go and like throw their hands behind it, which probably looks absolutely silly, which is part of the reason why some of us end up with PTSD, because we don't want to look goofy in front of people. And it's just like, So just go ahead and look goofy for a minute. It's okay. But when you do that, it actually allows your body to discharge all of that energy. So I've seen people who begin to shake and cry after they've experienced something really traumatic, and it's completely normal. It's completely normal to go through that. And sometimes it's healthy for your body just to be able to shake that off. And a lot of it has to do with providing the safe space to allow that to happen. But people have had those kind of responses, then afterwards they were completely fine because they let their bodies do what they were supposed to do. Your body always wants to heal, but sometimes things get in the way that don't allow that to happen. So that answer it, or?
Yeah, to a point.
Okay. Yeah, so sometimes it happens, not always does somebody have a seizure, but most of the time it's not an epileptic seizure or like a true seizure.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
You call it a psychotic?
No, psychogenic. So psycho as in from the mind, and genic like genesis, like genic has an origin in the mind.
To the body.
Yeah. So it's coming. Yeah, that's the origin of it. It's coming from the body. All right. Yes. And then I'll come back over here. Yeah.
Point, I know that sometimes in massage therapy,
Mhm.
if people can, or go back in their mind, sometimes things can happen on that table
Yes.
as far as crying or
Yes.
deep breathing, or when they finally get some kind of release, even just in muscles, they've been holding things in their muscles and
Yes.
whatnot. So you can definitely see.
Yes. And in fact, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. In fact, massage is actually another thing that helps to treat trauma. This is trauma has probably been the one mental health disorder that's caused a lot of therapists to realize that you got to do more than talk to people to help them. And the body is such a huge part of trauma. So people actually have experienced massive trauma releases just from somebody touching them or having massage, because that massage actually allows them to reconnect with their bodies and experience a release of that tension, because your body really will carry things like this. There was a gentleman who couldn't straighten out his arm because of a trauma he had. And the story they told was that, he was a firefighter and he heard a car accident happen while he was sitting at a diner. And, he's like, okay, emergency mode, goes into it, like no big deal. But he went in there and he saw the car was flipped upside down. There was gasoline was pouring out, and you could tell that the driver did not survive because they hit the pole. But what they didn't realize was that there was a kid in the back. And so as they were reaching for the keys, they looked in there and they saw the kid, and it caused them to freeze. And their arm would not extend beyond this because their body literally said, I'm still stuck here. And the body wouldn't move. And so what the person actually did in therapy, there's a lot more going on. I'm just going to skip to the part that everybody can trace with, is he had the person kind of mentally go back into that experience of being in the car, but this time accepting that that child's pain is over. It's okay. You can turn off the car. And he like moved his arm to turn the car off, and then he regained the sense and movement in his arm again. Like that's how deeply these things become frozen in the body. Because remember, somebody who has trauma is not remembering, they're reliving. And the only way to get out of that constant cycle of reliving the same moment is to finish what was not finished. That's what the polar bear is doing. It's finishing the action. Yes.
You were talking about something before, and is that basically where it is like baby shaking syndrome, or whatever they call that, where people shake the baby and the baby is really going through a lot of trauma?
Yeah, well, yeah, with yes, I mean, like, so when you shake a baby, it's not necessarily the kind of trauma that we see with PTSD, but like, when you're shaking the baby, I mean, the baby, like you've seen babies, they have kind of like the rubber necks, they can't even hold their heads up. That's because their heads are gigantic. I mean, if your head was large as a baby's, like you've watched little infants, they try to reach their hands up and they can barely get their hands over the top of their head. Now, I'm not a super tall guy, but like if my head was so large that my hands can touch the top up here, I would have a very massive head. And so if you shook me around with the head this large, you're going to mess some things up. You're going to sever some things. And that's part of the reason why shaking the baby is extraordinarily dangerous, because all these little parts are very fragile and like can cause some serious damage. So it's, even if the child survives, then they usually have a lot of other problems. But I don't know how much they would be able to remember the trauma, because it would just cause so much physical damage. I don't even know if they can get to the emotional part of it because of how much damage that caused. Never shake a baby. So yes.
On the vagus nerve,
Yes.
how much help or healing is there in stimulating or massaging the vagus nerve into what part it affects? Because the vagus nerve going down the spine affects arms, spine, all of
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So the question was, can you stimulate the vagus nerve as a method of healing? And the answer is yes. And for the vagus nerve, it'll be a little bit different than trying to train the body to let go of something. The way this one works is that your vagus nerve is what helps to regulate your emotions. And so if you help the vagus nerve to be stronger, like if you exercise that nerve, then you actually get more control over your emotions. So it won't be so much having control over your body, but getting control over your emotions. But those things are very deeply connected.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, once you feel like you can control your emotions, then your body does start to actually come back online too. But it's an indirect one. One really quick tip on how to stimulate the vagus nerve. This is one everybody can do when you get home. You can do it here. I'm not going to because I'm not very good at it. And that is singing.
See?
Yes, singing.
Wow.
I guess I'm not very good at talking either. So singing, yeah. So singing actually does it. And part of the reason it will do it is like, let's just say you were breathing in, and when you breathe out, you're kind of humming and you would, like if you hum really, really low, then what happens is you actually can start to stimulate your vagus nerve through your humming and even through your singing, like if you hum a song. But when you do that, when you stimulate the vagus nerve, not only do you get a little hit of nitric oxide, which is kind of cool, and it stimulates your immune system, it also helps to stimulate the vagus nerve so that it can actually start to gain more tone.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's just pretty cool. They also have, they actually have implants that stimulate the vagus nerve as well. And some people experience benefit from it, some people don't, but there's other ways to exercise the vagus nerve. All right, so we'll probably have to pause here because we've done our 15 minutes of question, but please keep your questions coming. We will have, 4 more presentations that will come up and we'll look more into some specific topics. The next one that we'll be doing, we'll be looking at domestic violence. Then we'll be doing the ones that look at identifying signs and symptoms in children. We'll have another one on intergenerational trauma. So you don't want to miss that one either. This looks at how trauma can get passed down from generation to generation. And then for our very last presentation, we're going to just look directly at methods for healing trauma. And so I've given you a little bit of snapshots of it today, but there's more presentation that's coming afterwards. And make sure to bring a friend with you. If you want to get the links to there, anybody that wants to watch online, if you have friends that don't live here, they scan that QR code, they can actually join us on Zoom. We'll be recording these meetings and also posting them so people can watch them at another time, but we'd love for you to join us live so I can directly answer any questions that you have. But with that, we'll go ahead and dismiss for this evening. And we hopefully will see you again tomorrow at 2. All right, well, please do take care and have a good evening. I'll stick around, so if you have any other questions I can answer directly, then I'm happy to do that too. But thank you for your time and attention, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow afternoon.